Everybody. I am so honored to be here today, and especially honored with having a lot of community college members in my own family, and my father and mother both in particular started in community colleges, and one of them did go on to get a doctoral degree at one point. I'm a professor at USC. I was at the University of Michigan for 3 years before that, and I earned my PhD at Michigan. Before I was at Michigan, I worked in the McNair Scholars Program. Are there any McNair Scholars in the room? Not yet today, but maybe in the future. It's an awesome program that the U.S. Department of Education funds on a number of college campuses to encourage greater faculty diversity through undergraduate research experiences. And I worked in McNair for 4 years, developing a passion for education, particularly at the graduate level. And then at one point I decided it was time for me to pursue my own PhD. So my research focuses on access and equity in graduate education, and it's not by mistake. I think that if we want to improve academia, we're going to need to improve graduate school, because that is the training ground for our future professorate. In particular, what we need to pay attention to are the sort of everyday norms and values that people are absorbing in graduate school. You learn a lot of subject matter. Everybody knows that. You learn a lot about what it means to be a professor or a scholar, but what we haven't really paid attention to is the potential for changing the professorate through the kinds of norms and values that people take on, and the kinds of norms and questions that people start to question themselves as they're being exposed to them in graduate school. So in thinking about the future of the professorate, think a lot about graduate school. So today my plan is to talk with you about my research on graduate admissions decision-making. In particular, I'll think about with you what counts as merit in practice, why faculty have a tendency to lean in the admissions process on criteria that undermine their professed diversity goals, and how the system is changing and what holistic review is as part of that. I'll also interweave throughout this discussion of things that you can keep in mind as students thinking about a PhD, and then leave some time at various points in the presentation for reflection and conversation with one another. So when I worked in McNair, it was at the University of Northern Colorado. This is me with my first cohort of students. And I had just moved to Colorado and was like 3 days into the new job with boxes of books still up against the wall, when a student named Abby bounded into the room and said, "All right, I'm here. The person in this office before you convinced me to go to graduate school, and now you're going to help me get in. What are graduate students needing? What are faculty going to be looking for in graduate students?" And I kind of mumbled under my breath something about the GRE and research experience, and it was good that she was doing McNair, but I said, like a good student myself, that I would go and do a review of the literature and see what it says. Well, surprisingly to me, the literature actually has relatively little to say about what faculty are looking for in graduate students. And so the kernel of a research study was planted for me that day, that about 10 years later, I finally went and began to conduct research on myself. Now, the reason I was working in McNair at the time, and the reason that I continue today to study doctoral education, is that there's significant disparities by gender and race and socioeconomic status in graduate education. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that today women are earning close to 50% of all PhDs that are awarded, but there's a huge amount of variation from 17% or less in some of the STEM disciplines like physics, all the way up to 71% in psychology. And if we look across race, you can see that African American, Latino, and Native American students, and some Asian American populations, are significantly underrepresented among doctoral degree recipients relative to their representation in the population. And actually, Native American representation is at its lowest point in 25 years and going down. So, why is this? The empirical research suggests there's a tension, effectively, in how faculty profess the importance of diversity relative to what they value in practice. Certainly, admissions decisions are related to diversity considerations, and some of the best empirical work talks about how diversity is accounted for. We also know that if you have any responsibility for writing a mission statement or creating a website, that a lot of universities are very concerned with the image of diversity that they present, right? This was brought home to me a long time ago. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin. And some of you might know the story of Diallo Shabazz, who was an undergraduate there at the same time I was doing my master's degree. He was walking through the main administration building one day and happened to notice a pile of applications. And so he looked at it a little bit more closely and saw his face on it. And he was used to seeing his face on various university promotional materials. Maybe some of you have had a similar experience. But what he didn't know was where he was in this photo. And he thought, I don't think I've ever gone to an outdoor sporting event at the university. Well, It turned out the admissions office was determined to have a diverse group at a sporting event portrayed on its application that year. And after poring through thousands of photos in their archives, they couldn't come up with a single one that met those two criteria. So they photoshopped him in. So he sued the university for $10 million, and he won, and had the money returned to the university for undergraduate multicultural affairs offices. So we can see from this story that institutions go to great lengths to present an image of diversity, even if it's not the reality. Relatedly, diversity is in part a matter of education and in part a matter of optics in higher ed today. So this suggests the other side of what I was finding in the literature at the time, that the work of graduate diversity officers is often stymied because you have one group of people who's involved in recruitment and another group of people who's involved in admissions decision-making, and they don't communicate very well or at all really with one another. There's also evidence that 2 of the 3 strongest factors that predict admission to PhD programs are things that prioritize populations who are already overrepresented in doctoral education, namely GRE scores and having gone to elite colleges. And then finally, some of you might have heard about a really interesting experiment that was conducted several years ago by some students in Pennsylvania, or pardon me, faculty there, where they sent out 600 emails to faculty around the country saying something like this. Dear Professor Posselt, I am currently an undergraduate student. I have research interests in X, Y, and Z. I'm thinking about applying to USC in the fall, and I think our research interests align. Would you be willing to have a meeting with me? Signed, so-and-so. And the only thing that they varied in this so-and-so was the person's name, to suggest that they might be a woman or a man, and to suggest that they might have different ethnicities. Well, they found exactly what you would hope that in 2018 you would not find. That women were less likely to get a response than men, and that students whose names suggested that they were either African American or Latinx or Asian American were less likely to get a response than those whose suggested their names were male and white. And that when those underrepresented groups did get a response, it took significantly longer. So this, they concluded, was evidence of unconscious bias, and they were trying to understand what might be the root of this, which they couldn't get from their data. But my data helped get it to the root of some of this. I study organizational sociology, and I pay a lot of attention to both the way that people interact with each other and the kind of decision-making processes that get made. So, once upon a time, in 2010, I was in the hallway at the University of Michigan, and I ran into my professor after hours, and we got to chatting, and I admitted my crazy idea for a dissertation to him, which was to study how faculty behind the scenes are making admissions decisions. And he thought it was a crazy idea and that I should totally go for it. And because I had that support, I decided to do it. And I'm really glad that I did. It eventually led to a book that was published in 2016 from the study, in which I was looking at the research questions: how do faculty individually judge and collectively select applicants to highly ranked PhD programs? What assumptions about merit are guiding their judgment? And how do disciplinary norms shape what faculty judgment looks like? So for those of you in the social sciences, this was a comparative ethnographic case study, which means, in my case, that you move your family across the country for 2 years, and you try to stay with the departments as long as they allow you. And in my case, I was able to conduct 85 interviews with professors and a few graduate students, and stay with those departments over the course of an entire academic year. 6 of the programs actually allowed me to observe their meetings, which, as you can imagine, was fascinating. I tried to get a balance of programs across the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. And then within each of those, because I'm a higher education scholar, I paid attention to the difference between disciplines that are known for being high consensus, fields like economics and physics and philosophy, which have centralized and hierarchical knowledge structures, relative to ones like political science and linguistics, where you might have someone who's trained as a philosopher sitting side by side with somebody who's trained in quantitative modeling. And I was curious about whether people's training lead them to see the world and to see students in fundamentally different ways that force them into having a harder time coming to consensus about who should be admitted. Looking at the individual level, you can see that my sample is roughly representative of what admissions committees in these departments look like. And it's not good from a standpoint of faculty diversity. In fact, someone once said to me, your sample justifies the need for a study like yours, because the people who are in these departments, which were ranked in the top 15 for their field, were predominantly male and predominantly white. You can see that only 3% were domestic-born scholars of color across all of these samples. So the voices that you'll hear as I share the data are disproportionately white and disproportionately men. So what did I find? I found that each of these departments has an evaluative culture of their own, and that if you dig into the details of this evaluative culture, you start to see some of this tension between how merit is being defined and how diversity is being valued. I found that faculty had a clear preference for certain criteria, and that those preferences were rooted in beliefs about what they signal. Namely, they had a really hard time letting go to some of these commonly held criteria because they were linked to their own identities as scholars in elite departments. Second, I found that they displayed also a preference for a certain sort of admissions process that was going to be both efficient and collegial. And this led them to try to quantify quality in various ways and to minimize the amount of conflict. Actually, what I had people tell me over and over again is that they preferred to save their arguing for tenure and promotion decisions as opposed to admissions decisions. In those fields that I classified as high consensus, I found that faculty had shared norms, shared ideas about what should be valued, and this affected how they thought about merit, how they talked about intelligence, and how they decided admissions should be done. But in those lower consensus fields, there was no such sort of shared set of things that everybody could defer to. And so individual preferences had a much stronger role. This included 4 clear patterns of what sociologists call homophily, or love of the same, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And then finally, I wouldn't be telling the whole story if I didn't acknowledge that there was a fundamental ambivalence about change efforts, particularly any sort of reform that's related to diversity and equity, because these required faculty to confront their own biases and their collective biases. So, in thinking about change going forward, we have to pay attention not only to sort of the process that's being done, but to faculty mindsets about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what I want to do is go through a number of these with you. I'm going to share some data from number 2, number 1, and number 4. So, if you're not familiar with the PhD admissions process, basically what happens is there's a committee that gets delegated to make decisions in most cases on behalf of the entire department. And what I found is that they adapt this idea of deliberative democracy, which is one where everybody is involved in the decision-making process, to one that can accommodate the large volume of applications that they receive. So because they're trying to figure out how to deal with the volume, they implement practices that are very bureaucratic. They delegate work not to the entire department, but to the committee members. They quantify their judgment because that judgment helps to hide some of the lack of agreement that they have. And then they refocus committee discussion away from controversial matters of content to less controversial matters of process. And this helps them get the job done more quickly. So I found that committees are helping to mediate individual perspectives and preferences with the collective will of the professors. They make appointments to who should sit on these committees in order to downplay some of their internal conflicts and to buffer the process from difficult people and personalities. A great example of this was in linguistics, where the committee had just gone through a long and arduous process of redefining what their long-term strategic plan should be. And not everybody agreed with this new strategic plan, and so the department chair, rather savvy, appointed this year's admissions committee to select people who were on board with this new plan, thinking that their preferences could help buffer the sort of department from the changes that were underway. In all of the departments that I looked at, there were administrative staff who facilitated the process and who put far more work into it than any of the faculty did. In 3 of the 10 committees, student members were part of the process and voted as full members. And in many cases, they would bring in people who were on the faculty but not part of the committee who might have specific kind of expertise, either about research topics that students had, or in many cases, someone who knew something about a geographic area. For example, someone who knows the scene of higher education in China could help with the large numbers of applications from China. And what I found is that in many cases, they quantified judgment in order to cut through many of the ambiguities that come with trying to compare applicants who are different on many dimensions. So much so that over and over again, faculty described admissions as a numbers game to me. They talked about it as a numbers game in terms of their reliance on GRE scores and grades, a tendency to take a general rating of an applicant and turn it into a sort of a single number, and then to take their ratings of single applicants and turn it into a rank-ordered list that somehow sort of represents people's relative admissibility. And that list was important because it gave them a jumping-off point for discussion about who should be admitted. A sociologist who recognized the power that those individual ratings hold in terms of who's ultimately admitted said, "We all went off into our little corners and read and submitted our rankings. That's where the decision really got made. It wasn't like the decision got made in the committee." So the initial impression that a faculty member would have when they read an application could become very important to a student's ultimate chances. And then finally, for this set of findings, I found a really interesting trend where, in order to minimize conflict, faculty would try to maintain some level of discussion about things that were non-controversial. So one thing to know about academic life is that they care a lot about collegiality and getting along with each other. But there's kind of a dark side of collegiality, which means that they don't pay attention to things that are controversial among them. And they often don't discuss issues that are uncomfortable. It's one of the reasons that race and gender, I think, are such sticky issues among the professorate, is that most people don't want to have honest conversations about these things. Instead, they say things like, we definitely try to make people happy. We try to satisfy big egos. And so in this case, they recognize that finding consensus about their applicants would require time and conflict that they wanted to avoid. But they still needed to have some degree of discussion in order to uphold the legitimacy of the process. And so they reserved their discussion for what ratings mean. In the philosophy department, for example, people sat back in their chairs and they mused for like 15 minutes about what is a 1. They really thought deeply about what does it mean to give someone a 1 rating versus a 2 rating. They seemed very comfortable with the disagreement about that. They struggled over where to draw the lines, recognizing that the difference between an average rating of a 2.03 versus a 2.13 might not really mean anything in practice, but that at some point they needed to be able to draw lines. And then they did often have extended discussion about a few borderline cases. So one of the conclusions from this for me when I'm speaking with faculty about this is to reiterate how important deliberation is and to get comfortable discussing matters that are otherwise uncomfortable to them. Because what I also saw is that there's a lot of power in friendly debate. When people trust each other and are willing to challenge each other's misperceptions, that's how learning happens. That's how people work their way out of biases that have become institutionalized as normal. And then finally, the same deliberations with which conventional ideas about merit are reinforced can also be used to redefine what merit means. This is what I call rewriting some of the standard scripts about merit and diversity, which I'll go into next. So, one of the things that was cool about following these committees over the course of an entire year is I could see that the sort of judgments that they were making when they were doing their initial screening were very different than the judgments when they were looking among people on their shortlist. And what merit meant when they were doing their initial screening was in large part conventional achievement, and specifically people whom they believed to have a low risk of not completing their degree. And so here the important criteria were the numbers. I heard that over and over and over again. GRE scores and grades, which they would contextualize according to how prestigious their undergraduate curriculum was and how rigorous they felt it was. So this sort of standard of merit is certainly in conflict, or at least in tension with racial and gender diversity aims, because the people who are most likely to be getting very high GRE scores and going to the most elite of the elite undergraduate institutions are not the same students who are going to contribute to the racial and gender diversity that they say they're trying to seek. Now, if the applicants could surmount this initial hurdle, they would be subjected to a very different kind of review, in which faculty were thinking not about the present, but about the future of their disciplines. And here faculty paid a lot of attention to students' experience with research, whether they seemed to love research or seemed to just be doing it as a technical task, whether someone was going to bring a unique perspective from their professional or personal experiences, and whether their interests aligned with that of the faculty. And here, diversity was really critical to being able to be admitted and was very central to how merit was being discussed. So I want to pause here and be very clear about the fact that this is a system that I observed in 2010 and 2011, and it's one that I think is changing. And I work with graduate schools and graduate programs all around the country, and I see this sort of rigid system softening. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how I see it softening in a little bit, but I don't want anyone to sit out there feeling anxious that this is sort of the world that you inhabit. This was a world of almost 10 years ago, and one that I think is softening. But I think it is worthwhile to hear a little bit about how faculty make sense of some of the common criteria. One of the theories that I used, and I promise I won't talk too much theory, but just a little bit for the sociology and other social science folks out there. Irving Goffman was a scholar who basically compared all of social life to theater. This is called a dramaturgical theory. And he argued that we go about our lives sort of playing certain roles and adhering to certain scripts that we think those around us either expect from us, that we choose to perform, or that we think the people around us will accept. And indeed, I saw that faculty adhered to common scripts about what GRE scores meant. Specifically, I found that they interpreted GRE scores and grades in terms of intelligence. But they didn't just look at intelligence as something for its own sake, but because they associated intelligence with things that were very important to them personally. Namely, who belongs in elite communities like theirs, and who seems to have an acceptable risk profile. So let me show you a little bit of the data about this. Now, in the interviews that I conducted, more than 50% of the sample, when I asked them straight up, what do GRE scores signal, gave me some sort of idea about intelligence. I heard the words native intelligence heard way more than I thought that I would have, but also more colloquial phrases like sheer intellectual horsepower. And here it was really good for me to be able to observe committee meetings because I was actually able to see this happen in real time as well. More than 50% of the time that the GRE came up when faculty were in discussions with one another, it was within the same sentence or breath or idea as they were talking about intelligence. So I created a code in my data called Smart Talk that captured some of this. So here's some of the Smart Talk about students with high scores on top. Someone who does that well on the GRE is unlikely to be lame-brained. They are likely to be smart. And then there was this kid from Harvard who had gotten a perfect 4.0 and who had perfect GRE scores on all 3 sections of the test. And a senior professor kind of muttered under his breath about him that he was a freaking genius. And the committee had a good laugh about it, but then someone raised the point that, but he can't be our bar against whom everybody else is compared. That's just not normal behavior, right? So it was important for them to be able to calibrate what they thought of as intelligent and then to realize that they were needing to think more broadly than that. Lots of rude comments about students with low scores. Over and over again, I heard things like, I question she has what it takes. Is she going to make it? And then to this issue about belonging, someone made a comment in the biology department about a student from Russia that he was from a different planet, and we were confident this person was not going to be one of us. He's not going to be a full member of the scientific community. So, a prevailing theme in the discussions of this, as I mentioned, is relating intelligence to risk. And in these departments, they saw risk aversion as a certain sort of obligation that they had in order to be investing in students whose potential they felt good about, but also a luxury because they had applications from so many students that were so high achieving. But there were also some great examples, what I call counterscripts, of challenges to the risk aversion narratives. So in philosophy, Bob said, her GREs present a risk for her not succeeding, particularly because she didn't attend a top-rated university. Lynn said, she may have undershot. This is an area that can be gendered. We have to be very careful here. And then Bob says, all in all, it gives me doubt. So you see Lynn interjecting and correcting her colleague for holding a view of things that was narrow and actually just straight up inaccurate. Okay, so we need committees where people are willing to challenge one another. Here's another example of someone challenging risk scripts. She might be a bet, but it could be a good bet. If we're going to increase diversity, these are the students we need to take seriously. And then Jack says, what's the diversity? Nancy says, family financial hardship. So they agree to move her forward in the process, but then the discussion continues. Nancy says, it'll be good for the whole faculty to take a look at her file. It seems pretty clear that she's a risk, but if we're going to increase diversity, we have to take risks. And Denise says, and she seems like a good bet. Unfortunately, this student was ultimately not admitted, but it was a really nice example for them and for a number of people that I've spoken with since then around the country, that we need to be able to go beyond our standard assumptions. And here's why. Most of the time, faculty have really gigantic blind spots when it comes to their assumptions about risk, okay? Most of them are untested assumptions. We know that it's almost impossible to predict who's going to complete a PhD in any case, but especially for populations who rarely enroll. This is, if you like statistics, a problem with small n's. But also the validity of GRE exams and other types of graduate admissions criteria vary quite a bit for what kind of outcome we're looking at. One of the things that is clearest, though, is that the GRE is only a valid predictor of who gets very high first-year grades in graduate school. But here's the secret. In graduate school, they don't really care if you get high grades. As long as you get a B or an A, you're fine. So there's a lot of assumptions about what risk looks like and how we predict it that are embedded in this. And then finally, one of the things that I like to make my soapbox is that it's a really bad idea for us to think about our student outcomes not only in terms of what students have brought to us on day one, because it undermines the value of the education that we've provided. Our student outcomes are dependent not only on what they bring to us, but rather the kind of education and culture that we create, in which some people are more and less likely to succeed. So, here's a little pop quiz. You didn't think you were going to get that today. I'd like you to consider for a moment imagining a world in which it were possible to have two files that are completely equal. Which folder a department should admit? Should it be the student who has a GRE quantitative score of a 740, which is at the 80th percentile, or the student who has a perfect GRE score of 800? Take a moment and think about it. So there are lots of different reasons that you might come to different conclusions about this, but I've given you a trick question because, like every statistic, the GRE score is a statistic, which means it has error associated with it. And ETS itself acknowledges that scores are an inexact measure, and only score differences that exceed the standard error of measurement can serve as a reliable indication of real differences in knowledge and developed abilities. So here's where I give you one more test on this quiz. What do you think is the standard error of measurement for a 740 on the quantitative GRE? Anyone want to shout it out? Someone out there is thinking 60 points. Which means that a 740 and an 800 are statistically equivalent. And it means that if you have a chance to be in conversation with people who are responsible for GREs, we need to be paying attention to how discussions of a 10 and 15 point increment are discussed in practice. So those are some of the scripts associated with GRE scores. I want to turn now to talk about the scripts that are associated with diversity itself. One of the common threads in my data was that faculty feel a real obligation to be considering diversity now. But they also feel like they have an obligation to be considering it in particular ways. One comment from a sociologist I think exemplifies it nicely. He would say, you have to be above a bar, and then we can ask the diversity question. I think that's bunk. I don't think that the bar should be separated from the diversity question, period. I also don't think that we should be establishing a bar that precedes it. But that was their view, and this is a really common view, actually. Another common view, if there are two students that are, in my view, equal on intellectual merit, then I will prefer a minority, okay? So, again, 2010, there's been a broadening in how people are thinking about it, but these are two sort of myths about diversity right now. Second, however, another common theme was that faculty would actually associate diversity with the prestige of their program, because they recognize that, especially among these more highly ranked PhD programs, being able to attract accomplished students was a way that they could evaluate themselves with one another. And being able to attract accomplished students from underrepresented backgrounds was in particular a feather in their cap. So I heard lots of things like, it sounds like he'll get in everywhere. Everybody will love him, in reference to students who had gone to college and earned good grades and who were contributing racial or gender diversity to their fields. But unfortunately, there's also a little bit of a pattern in some of these programs where students of color are being objectified. You can look at the languages in this last set of quotes here. Can we get her? Who are we going to get? We'll lose him, as if it's a possession to be had. And so we need to have honest and critical conversations about how students are being constructed. Then finally, the third script of diversity was associating it with opportunity. Both opportunities to give students a chance in life, but also an opportunity for the program to enhance their intellectual environment. As one person said in classics, students who come from other backgrounds will focus on other moments or ideas in the text. Also, students who have different backgrounds will have studied different things. There's a kind of desire, there's more of a drive in them. All right, so I'd like you to take the next 4 minutes, no more than that, and think about those qualities that I had you up on the first slide. Hopefully some of you saw that I'd like you to be paying attention to some of your own strengths as scholars. Because one of the things that is very clear is that as faculty are thinking more holistically now about what they're looking for students, that they are not only trying to find qualities in students, but they're thinking about cultivating it in them. So I'd like you to think about one of those 3 words that was on your mind, and describe an experience to the person next to you in which you exemplified that quality. And then if you both have had a chance to exchange ideas about that, have a short conversation about how you can continue cultivating this quality yourself. So take 4 minutes to discuss it, and I'll call you back then. All right, so if we had more time, what I would do, and if we had a whiteboard, what I would do is try to get a list of some of the qualities that folks have identified in themselves and in their peers and colleagues And then if I were working with faculty, as I often do faculty professional development workshops around admissions, I'd get them to name some of those qualities in themselves and in their most successful students. And then we talk about how it is that their admissions process is actually looking for those things. And if they couldn't give me a good answer, we wouldn't leave the room until they could. What they could do to start to look for those things that they know help students to be successful. One of the reasons that faculty hang on to this traditional image of the selection process is because it's the game that they played. And it's not just the game that they played, but it's ultimately one that they won. And this is part of a broader tradition in how people work, where we have a preference for people like ourselves. It's been described as a pervasive fact of social life. And in situations that involve evaluation and selection, like hiring, or recruitment or admissions, it's about cultural matching. Now, different fields of study would have different explanations for why it is that faculty prefer applicants like themselves. Psychologists would have an identity explanation, perhaps, and talk about the sort of self-affirmation that happens when you value somebody who's like yourself. Sociologists might quote Pierre Bourdieu and say that when elites have preferences for people who are like themselves on some level, it helps them protect the legitimacy of their status. And organizational scholars would talk about the decision-making process as one that's filled with uncertainty, and how reliance on shared networks implies this sort of magical and mysterious idea of fit, which I don't have time to go into today unless someone wants to ask a question about it. Now, what I observed is that there were four most frequently observed types of homophily. One, in which faculty looked for applicants who came from institutions like their own. And let me be clear, this isn't just about the Ivy League. This is about people who went to places like UCLA, being excited to see UCLA on their on applications, or people who had gone to a small liberal arts college, getting excited to see something like that themselves. There's a form of coolness that I observed, and certainly did not go looking for, which I'll talk about in a moment. In all of the programs that I was looking at, but 8 of the 10 most strongly, there was at least one person on the committee who came from a relatively modest background, low SES, low income, or had gone to an unselective sort of undergraduate experience before transitioning into college, and their experiences led them to value other people who had been socially mobile in particular ways. And then in some of the committees, there were people who either had gone to college or had grown up outside the United States, and themselves had valued that in applicants and tried to keep international background in the diversity conversation. So in case you're curious, this is what it looks like across fields. These are the types of homophily and where I observe them. So interestingly, that pedigree thing matters everywhere. But it was only in the higher consensus fields that I didn't see a strong role for this, and rather in the medium and low consensus fields that individual preferences for coolness, people who exhibited social mobility, and people who had international backgrounds were really valued. So once I saw this in my first time through the data, I coded for these forms of homophily in my second round through the data. And I observed an appreciation for academic pedigree everywhere. But what I don't want to talk about today is rather this coolness trend, because I think some of you will be curious about it. Pedigree kind of carries with it this assumption of like eliteness, but this is not the only way that people would be considered valuable, and I think this is one of the ways that our system is changing. What counts as interesting to applicants and faculty is not always just this very narrow sort of idea of suede elbow patches and an Ivy League education. No, this was something that was very real in my data, and something tells me in California would play as well. So I noticed that a few applicants, instead of being described as excellent or strong, which would be nice common ways for great applicants to be discussed, were being called cool, cool, cool. I heard it over and over again. So I started paying attention to who was using the language of cool. And interestingly, I saw that the people who were using the cool word managed their self-presentation in 2 specific ways. There's one profile, kind of this like random dude on the left, stock photo, that I call the rumpled preppy. And then the other faculty profile who was using the language of coolness was what I call the aesthetic sleek, sort of a Steve Jobs type with a black turtleneck and pierced ear. Now, how could a student be judged cool? I started to pay attention to who are the students who are being judged cool. Well, it's people who were doing research interests or research that was way out at the edge of their field, really provocative or interesting topics. And these people's work would be described as cool, or the ultimate compliment to get sexy research. Wow. And back in 2010 to 2012, people also would be impressed by certain forms of technology use. People who would be able to discuss blogging, or who would have multiple devices. There was this one particularly obnoxious example of somebody doing the aesthetic sleek thing who had a tablet, a computer, and 2 different phones, and a BlackBerry out in front of him in the meeting, as if he needed 5 different devices in order to adequately participate in an admissions conversation. So let me give you some examples of how this played out in practice. He was strong in a conventional way. He was everything you look for and nothing you weren't expecting. And then an associate professor in the room said, like a Ford. And as someone who was at the University of Michigan at this time in Southeast Michigan, I was displeased when I heard this, and I had to sort of watch my face. And then about a student from Yale who had crummy grades, they said, I'd be willing to go up on my rating. I read this right after another application in the concentration, and I wanted to be stingy with my wants. Plus, she writes articles for Slate, really cool. And then the associate professor says, she seems like an interesting person. And this student was ultimately admitted. So it's this point about interesting that I want to highlight, that interesting is one form of coolness, or rather maybe coolness is one form of interesting, but that in admissions processes that are really competitive, it's hard to be admitted if there isn't a sense that someone on the committee likes you. And if a person is going to be tending toward this coolness thing, it might be something that they were looking for. Now, more common than the cool thing, the cool pattern, was a pattern of social mobility, where I saw that advocacy for people from modest backgrounds or less selective colleges was something that was explicitly desired and looked for, okay? This was faculty who were looking to pay forward opportunities that they thought someone once might have given them, and the sense that they had a unique qualification to be able to interpret the application from students who are from these backgrounds. One of the things I saw is that they would be able to offer alternative interpretations about where someone went to college or what their academic accomplishments should mean. So here's 2 examples from sociology. From someone who had grown up in a very, very poor area in Indiana. I understand the learning curve that they had to go through a little bit more. Had I not had my experience, I wouldn't realize that if you're coming from a first-generation family, no one's telling you how to apply to college, that you should try to go to the best one. You may be thinking, if I can go here, I can help out my family. I won't have huge loans. And then another professor in the same department, who interestingly was also the one who said, first you have to be above a bar, then we'll ask the diversity question. He said, I think I'm just much more open to looking at, they got a 4.0. They did everything they could there. The letters of recommendation are really terrific. Where somebody who went to Harvard might think, even if they had a lower GPA, they might have a better education. So these 2 examples right here are what I call in my book counterscripts, the sort of alternative interpretations or alternative decision pathways that people use to advocate for applicants who are from less elite backgrounds. And these are rooted in 2 different things. One, different interpretations of common criteria, or data that helps correct misperceptions or that updates their colleagues' prior knowledge. And what's exciting about the presence of counterscripts in these conversations is that this is a very small window into the possibilities for change because people are able to challenge one another and correct these misperceptions. One of the things that I saw was very clear, though, is that they were only effective in actually shifting the conversation when a critical mass of the committee would get on board with a particular counterscript. A person can say anything they want, but if that person doesn't have any support, if no one's got their back for that particular perspective, it would just sort of float into the ether. So here's a couple more examples of counterscripts. This one having to do with where people had gone to college. This was about their own type of program. As I mentioned, most of these programs were really selective, and so this person said, we don't just have the most to lose from taking risks, we also have the most to give. And then a sociologist said, achievements to date for me are not terribly meaningful. The one thing we know about really strong undergraduates is that they're tremendous grade gatherers. I'm sure there's none of you in the room who are tremendous grade gatherers. Figure out what a teacher wants and deliver. They're trying to achieve as conventional students, and that's not what makes a good scholar. So they would recognize that there are lots of people who are great students out there, but what makes a great scholar is research. And that is another thing that I know is out there in this group today. So, counterscripts are one way that we have possibilities for change in this system. But I want to highlight in conclusion that student by student and professor by professor, this system is one that I believe is changing. I'm starting to see much more attention to recruitment and retention efforts alongside this, which is really critical because you can imagine that if you were to only change admissions, then you might affect who's ultimately going to come for a campus visit day. But if those who come for a campus visit ultimately get a sense that the environment is elitist or that they're going to be isolated, it might lead them to ultimately enroll somewhere else, which just reproduces the sort of problems of inequality in who enrolls. So we have to pay attention simultaneously to recruitment and retention and admissions. One of the things that's pretty clear is that student organizations are strengthening, both organizations for first-gen students, disciplinary associations, and students of color organizing on their own behalf. I do a lot of work with graduate schools and PhD programs, both through disciplinary associations as well as universities. And I'm seeing a much stronger commitment to rigorous forms of holistic review. There's also the test optional movement that some of you may be familiar with. Graduate schools and PhD programs are reconsidering their GRE policy in ways that I think ultimately can help access for students who are less likely to earn great GRE scores. And then it's a little bit harder to put my finger on, but there's clearly been in both higher education research and among faculty and administrators a shift away from a discussion of diversity, which really doesn't account for the fact that we're talking also about power and inequality here, toward one where we're explicitly discussing equity and inclusion issues. And I think we have to be able to have honest conversations about race, about gender, about racism and sexism if we want to be able to move toward equity and inclusion. So, very much in conclusion, I want to highlight one particular example of this that I think is a really promising case study. So, as a follow-up to the admissions study, I did a comparative case study that looked at 4 programs that are enrolling significantly more students of color or women, in spite of being in states with affirmative action bans, to try to understand what's going on in those departments that others could learn from. And I want to talk very briefly about the Applied Physics program at the University of Michigan, which is one in which some of the tensions of diversity and equity efforts were resolved. If you're interested in reading more about this, it's published in 2017 with my totally awesome Michigan Dream team of grad students, Kim Reyes, Kelly Slay, Aurora Kamamura, and Kamario Porter. So this is a department that was founded in the 1980s at the same time as the University of Michigan was doing what was called the Michigan Mandate. And this department is very proud of the fact that it's trained about 10% of the black physicists in America over the last decade. It was able to do so through a long process, about 25 years of effort in changing a lot of what they do. Both the director and the Michigan president at the time, Jim Duderstadt, were intent on, quote, knocking down some of the walls that have contributed to disparities. And so over time, they've gained a national reputation. They've gone to the White House with President Obama to accept recognition for their efforts. And what we found is that in this department, they were resolving some of the tensions of equity efforts by manipulating traditional boundaries about how their intellectual paradigm should be defined. In particular, they were thinking about the value of applied knowledge and interdisciplinary knowledge, which enables us to have a more concrete engagement with using our disciplines for social problems that are important to our communities. I found that administrative staff in these departments served as cultural translators. The administrative staff were women and people of color, and the faculty empowered them to be full partners in recruitment and to be able to correct faculty when they were not getting it, quote unquote, with respect to race and gender within the department. And so faculty took a sort of humble status about their capacity to work with students, and their literacy as educators improved by working with their staff. I saw a really genuine role for community in this particular department. And although I thought it was kind of a cliche when I entered that everyone was using this phrase, welcome to the family, that the longer I stayed with them, the more I could see that they actually interacted with each other by going above and beyond what students and faculty typically do for each other. And then finally, taking us back to the conversation about merit, I saw that they reframed who they thought of as their ideal student, in particular to be able to be aligned with this different intellectual paradigm that they had. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. The prior director said that we always had more flexible admissions criteria than comparable programs. We downplayed the standardized tests. We jettisoned the physics GRE almost immediately. And we're actually using the English aspect of the GRE more than the quantitative reasoning aspect. But even that was diminished in importance. We looked at the transcripts and we looked at research experience. Those were the dominant things that we looked at. And then finally, the current director said that what we did is brought in the best students we could find. Now, these are not like the typical definition of the best student who did their undergrad at Harvard, Princeton, or Yale and a 4.0 GPA and GRE scores up the wazoo. That's not what we were after. We were after people who would be willing to take a big risk. They hadn't necessarily got the best grades because people who take risks when they're undergrads very often don't have stellar GPAs. We wanted to look for those kinds of people who were intellectually adventurous and were willing to learn about other disciplines and willing to integrate themselves into others. Just sort of capping off this particular case study, Roy Clark, their the founding director, described the academic structures that we're dealing with as very, very old, older than 200 years. They go back 1,000 years. They're medieval. So what we want to do was to knock down those walls. All right, so Before we open it up for question and answer, I want to highlight a few specific things that I think it's useful for those of you in the audience who are considering PhDs to know. I'm sure one of the things that comes through clearly is that this is not a great system and that the system needs change. Unfortunately, like all systems, culture and academia do have a tendency to resist change. But there are some promising things that I think it's worth paying attention to. One, that the system is not uniform. Okay? There's subcultures, there's microclimates, and there's caring individuals everywhere. And if you are going to get a PhD, I wouldn't recommend enrolling anywhere that you don't have a really clear sense of who is going to be your advisor as a caring person. But also, I wouldn't go to a department that doesn't have a good reputation with current students who are from backgrounds like your own. So, as you try to get to know programs, try to get to know the students, try to connect with people, and identify who's there who might be a good support for you. Second, I think there's an emerging preference for difference. There isn't just this homophily tendency, it's what we would call in sociology heterophily, especially among people who are already engaged in their disciplines, as all of you are. Third, demographics is a very powerful force, and it's one that's on our side. This is the future of America, and I think faculty are finally starting to get on board with that, particularly the younger generation of faculty. And then interestingly, faculty are obsessed in many ways often about their relative status in some departments. And interestingly, I think that people are starting to recognize that super homogeneous departments are not legitimate because that doesn't represent America. And certainly if you want to stay in California, highly homogeneous departments are not legitimate. I'd keep a few things in mind about the admissions process in general. One, graduate programs want you. Do not have any question about that. I think the different ways that faculty are thinking about students from underrepresented backgrounds and students who are coming from community colleges and students who are first generation in their family, whether as immigrants and or in terms of going to college, faculty recognize that there's unique perspective to offer. Second, effort and performance, I think, can do a lot for your opportunity. I think they can get you into roughly the top quartile or so of the applicants to any program in America, whether we're talking about UCLA and Stanford and USC or Berkeley or some random place in the middle of nowhere America, okay? But the outcome, I don't care where we're talking about, is going to be up to things that are out of your control. I heard faculty talk so many times about how they were reviewing applications at 1 in the morning. They were talking about the people on their committee preventing them from feeling like they could actually say what they thought. So we're not getting the best of what our professors have to offer, okay? So when you are rejected from programs, because you will probably be rejected from programs, know that it is not about you. One of the things that's pretty clear is that I can talk about a system generally, but there are lots of informal admissions expectations, and they vary a lot by field. So I'm really glad to know that you have mentors in your fields and encourage you to talk with them about what's important in your particular field of study. One thing that is clear everywhere, and that is another thing in all of your favor, is that research experience is critical. Finally, I think it's useful to highlight that the way admissions is set up at the graduate level is to accommodate in any application a mix of strengths and weaknesses. You don't have to be stellar on every dimension of the application in order to have a really good shot. It's what's described as a compensatory evaluation process, which means that people are going to be trying to balance out various strengths and weaknesses. And you should stand on your strengths and really play those up and not be afraid of that. But at the end of the day, in part because my follow-up research has been about graduate student mental health, and in part because I once went through this system, and in part because I'm an advisor to graduate students now too, I want to close on the point that you are not your academic performance or your test score. You are more than that. You are more than that to your families and your communities and your peers. And so while all of this is important, and I want you to care about it, and I'm glad to support any of you as I can, remember that life has got to be about more than academics. It's got to be about more than career, and the more that you get comfortable with thinking holistically about yourself, the way we want faculty to be thinking holistically about you, I think the better future we'll be creating for all of us. Thanks. All right, so we have about 10 minutes, I think, for question and answer. Yes?
So I am actually curious about your thoughts on the fit thing. You said you
Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay, so fit is a complicated idea, and I think if professors are thinking seriously about it, they recognize that when they say fit, they mean many different things. They're thinking about research fit. They're thinking about the culture of their department. They're thinking about the kind of students whom they typically enroll relative to the ones whom they'd like to enroll. And I think it's a good idea for you to feel like you fit within a department on some level, or at least with a subgroup of people within a department. But that a lot of departments are making admissions decisions on the basis of things that have to do with fit that really are not relevant to their academic communities. And so if you're in an environment where you sense a really strong culture that you don't feel like you fit, I think you should be thinking about fit just as much as they should. Yes, in the back.
Do you mind going back to that slide where you discuss where you classify the different programs as high something, low something?
Oh, sure.
I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so within higher education, we treat academic disciplines like variables. And because this is a kind of variable that we can find matter, that different disciplines have different outcomes, we're looking for different ways to classify them and understand what makes them tick. So some studies in the 1970s were able to classify some fields as being more centralized and hierarchical, where there's more, we call them strong paradigm fields or high consensus fields. High consensus fields like physics, economics, and philosophy, they tend to be more powerful within the social sciences, natural sciences, and humanities. They have less turnover among their leadership. They tend to have more funds and status associated with them. But low consensus fields are interdisciplinary in nature, and I think a lot of the future of U.S. higher education is in lower consensus and interdisciplinary fields. We'll always have all these fields of study, but the kind of extent of there being a common paradigm that people are socialized into versus having a degree but having it mean something very different because there are many different concentrations is something that distinguishes some fields from others. Yeah,
Would then chemistry fall under high consensus or moderate consensus?
Yeah, chemistry is probably one that is somewhere between high and medium. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, one of the ways that I approached this was I did sort of informal histories of each of these disciplines to try to figure out how to classify them. And so, for example, compared to physics, philosophy is extremely diversified, but within the humanities, it has a much clearer sort of knowledge structure than classics or linguistics. Someone in the back corner, yes?
Yeah, you mentioned, I forget which slide it was, but you talked about staff, the importance of staff in the physics department that's graduating about 10% of all black physics students.
Dave, would you be able to carry the microphone over there? Sorry, I'm just having a hard time hearing you from the other corner. Oh, no worries. This is going to be like the best question of the day. I can't wait.
It's all good.
All right. Oh, geez. Okay. So the question I had was about the physics department that's graduated about 10% of all black physics majors in the
Yeah.
country. I wanted to know. They talked about the importance of staff in making these decisions for graduate admissions and all that, and I was wondering what is defined, what staff is defined as. Does it include adjunct professors and other sort of support staff that we don't generally think about? Are they people who work in like financial aid? Are they counselors? Like, what do you mean by staff?
Thank you. Yeah. If I could, I would talk for 30 minutes about this department because it's such an interesting place, and I think there's a lot that other places could learn from. The staff that I was thinking about, there were two individuals, and one was an administrative staff person who is a support staff, was hired to do mostly financial paperwork for the department, but who came to quickly play a role in recruitment, in student support, even in decision making. When they needed a new department chair, the dean came to this person and said, "We need your judgment as part of the conversation." The other person was hired as a program manager, so they had a little bit more authority. But in both cases, my concern is that these individuals were taking on responsibilities for which they were not necessarily being compensated. They were taking on responsibility that I think faculty have an obligation to become literate in working across culture and working across gender. And part of the success of the department was due to effort that was not necessarily being compensated. But yeah, it's administrative support staff who don't typically get a lot of attention in higher education research. They did have a couple of adjunct faculty in this department who were included in the admissions process. Yes? Got the microphone for you.
In one of the slides, really briefly, you talked about, I think it said female applicants, even though they had higher test scores or whatever that may be, they had higher dropout rates. And I was wondering if you could talk about how dropout culture perhaps relates to everything that you've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a really important point. One of the great myths is that people leave graduate school for academic reasons, and it's just not true. Most of the evidence suggests that when people leave PhD programs, it's for non-academic reasons. And so department PhD programs' obsession and the university's lack of infrastructure around services for graduate students, I think bears some complicity in this. And one of the things that people have studied and found very clearly over time is that women who perform equally as well as men in PhD programs are nonetheless more likely to leave PhD programs. And sometimes it's due to factors that are well identified, and sometimes it's due to narratives where you're not getting the full story from them. But yeah, I think that there's two different things that graduate programs could do in this front. One is to pay more attention to the kind of support structures that are available. And then graduate schools could do a better job integrating with the very large apparatus of student affairs and student support services that's available to undergraduates. There's also, though, just a mentoring in a mindset among faculty. There's more often a sort of sink or swim approach in graduate education. And I don't want to be making blanket statements, because that's certainly not how all faculty operate, and that's certainly not how all universities and graduate programs do. But when you're choosing a graduate program, those are things to keep in mind. I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, in the back.
I just wanted to get an understanding of how specific PhD programs such as sociology might view other disciplines, like applying from a different discipline.
So the question is, how do PhD programs like sociology view other disciplines?
Yeah, like I was an undergraduate, I'm a Chicano studies major. And let's say I want to go for my PhD in sociology.
Oh, I see. Yeah. This is an area where there's a lot of variation. So sociology is a good one if your undergraduate degree is in a different field. If you want a PhD in physics, there's a smaller range of undergraduate degrees that will be considered acceptable grounds for your training. So interdisciplinary PhD programs are very comfortable with your undergraduate degree coming from a variety of fields. So I think this is not a bad slide to have up here for a final one, because I would say roughly, and this is without hard empirical evidence behind it, that those lower consensus fields are more open to your undergraduate degree being from a field other than that same one, whereas it can be harder to get into a physics, economics, or PhD program, philosophy, economics, and physics PhD program if you don't have an undergraduate degree in that field. Am I answering your question? Great. Okay, actually, that was such a quick one. We do have time for one more if anyone has it. Yes? We've got the microphone coming to you. Oh, microphone's not on.
History fall under the consensus list?
I'm sorry, which one?
History.
Oh, history. Yeah, I really wanted to study history, and I really wanted to study English. I don't know. I would have to do a little bit more digging. I think perhaps moderate. Yeah. I wouldn't worry too much about it, to be honest. I mean, I think it's helpful in understanding the extent of the organizational processes, but graduate education, I think perhaps varies a little bit less by degree of consensus than how faculty operate with one another. So yeah, it's interesting to learn more about your discipline just in general though, and as you're considering where to apply, to start to notice the amount of variation among history programs or among chemistry programs. Great. Great, I'll be able to stay here for about 10 more minutes, but I know you all have meetings and presentations to get started with in about 15. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for having me.